For many decades, the big multinational tobacco companies denied any knowledge that cigarettes were bad for people. They made vast amounts of money, spent lots of cash lobbying politicians, always pleaded innocent of all accusations levelled against them.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
They even marketed their products as healthy lifestyle choices and encouraged the sale of cigarette-styled sweeties to children. They sat there in hearings and investigations and court cases and acted like little innocent victims wrongly accused of stealing cookies from the cookie jar. With the benefit of hindsight, research, some very determined people and not a few whistleblowers, we now know this all to be a giant scam. They knew damn well cigarettes were both harmful and addictive. They even spent millions on scientific research to make them more addictive. Both their claims and their advertising were entirely deceptive. They had amassed a fortune by marketing a product that they knew caused harm, and not only did they lie about it at every step of the way, they were actively engaged in activities that were both illegal and making tobacco products even more addictive and harmful. Eventually, however, when this all came out into the light, in America the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement came into effect. Basically, they screwed great wads of cash out of the tobacco companies every year as reparations for the harm they had done. It was less than they deserved, but at least their judgment day had finally come, and some justice was served. Now, I make no judgment if you personally smoke. I used to smoke like a bastard and loved every minute of it, but I'm glad that I stopped. It's your choice, and if it is your informed decision to smoke, so be it. Although I would note that it's actually quite hard to make an informed decision when you are already addicted to a substance and the people making that substance have been lying about it for many years. My point to all of this is that I think a similar scenario might play out with video game companies, manipulative monetization practices and the gambling addiction they are deliberately trying to foster in children. We are already seeing a massive rise in problem gambling and addictive behaviours in children, and it is almost universally associated with video games and mobile games. Well, that's a problem. And the parallels with the tobacco industry are shocking. Just like big tobacco, video game publishers are actively encouraging addiction, deny any harm or responsibility, they are actively engaging in deception and making a fuck ton of money whilst they're doing it. And just like big tobacco, their business model seems to be, we know we're doing evil, illegal shit, but we're making so much money, we're just gonna carry on, do lots of lying, and the court cases and potential prosecutions are just the price of doing business. Because if they get away with just half of their profits intact, that's still a vast amount of money. As a general rule, researching and covering the mainstream video game industry feels a bit like being the detective in Manhunter. You get strangely accustomed to the process of getting inside the minds of evil people, but this process comes at the price of your own humanity. I didn't actually have much humanity to begin with, so personally I haven't noticed any significant changes in my behaviour, but at least the part about getting into the minds of psychopaths was right on the money. You see, when you scrutinise AAA publishers, video game monetisation, and have first-hand experience of how the industry so readily slips into the business practices more commonly associated with, say, the mafia, you suddenly get used to the following cycle of events. You tell people about despicable things video game companies do. Everybody thinks you are making too much of a big deal about it. Then a year or two later, the companies push it so far that everything explodes in the news. And that it is something you've been trying to warn people about in vain. Rinse and repeat. Now, I absolutely get it. The first thing a cult does is claim that everyone else is lying to you. Although hopefully by the end of this video you will appreciate that a bunch of scientists, probably mostly female because it's the social sciences, and hopefully attracted to sweaty men who swear a lot, have somehow come to the same conclusions that I have been boring you about for years. So as an outspoken critic of video game publishers, naturally it is an absolute delight to see the penny finally drop in the academic and social policy world, as they have eventually dragged their slow moving arses into the modern reality that video game publishers represent an existential threat to consumer rights, a financial and legal threat to gamers, and constitute a real and documented threat to the mental health and well-being of an entire generation of younger gamers. Fucking hallelujah. I hate to sound like the equivalent of a video game hipster, but I hated predatory monetization before it was cool. Recent developments have started to make it look like nation states are wising up to the fact that the predatory abuses of video game companies are actually vastly more abusive than the manipulation and data harvesting of big tech like Google and Facebook, or whatever Facebook is called these days. Meta? You know, that really shit video game with the Xbox 360 avatars and the alien fella. But he used to be human. Am I right? Not only are video game publishers doing all the evil exploitative stuff that big tech are doing, but they're also literally extracting cash from people whilst they're doing it. That's problematic. Now, I have a well documented reputation for being cynical about video game publishers. I fully appreciate this reputation is hard fought for and well earned. I put in a lot of effort to establish it, and it is well justified. But I would note this. Despite having some of the most cynical, pessimistic, judgmental and scathing opinions about video game publishers, loot boxes, in-game gambling and monetization, thus far, on every count, I have eventually turned out to be either 100% correct, and on the occasions where I have been wrong, it's because the situation is actually worse than even I imagined. And I try incredibly hard to imagine the worst possible scenario. But this recent report, coming from the European Union, seems to paint a picture perfectly aligned with my most damning conclusions. What is this report and who made it? The report was made by the Bureau of European Consumer Unions, which is some kind of pan-galactic consumer rights unit that oversees issues throughout all EU nations. Kind of like the Interpol of consumer rights, without guns. Basically, it seems like this report started out with the intention of specifically evaluating the impact and ethics of loot boxes, but after a fairly cursory inspection of the issue, they came to the logical and rightful conclusion that vast swathes of the video game industry is entirely evil predatory fucks who have wandered off the reservation and are now weaponising psychology, the science of addiction, and social media influencer scams to completely exploit and fuck up an entire generation of gamers. Because money. The report, called Insert Coin, is a 56-page document which pretty much reads like a charge sheet for the video game industry, and it paints a picture of wholesale misbehaviour and complete absence of morality within the industry. This report contains words like casino, misleading, and deceptive. Nobody wins a cookie for realising that these guys took a good look behind the curtain and saw a bunch of predators crouching there. So what were the major findings? They open up straight away in the executive summary with a salvo about loot boxes, or as I prefer to call them, pedo caches. Jesus, they really go hard. They turn that key and then stamp on the gas with no fucks given. I was actually quite impressed. Here are the key points of concern in their executive outline. 1. Exploiting cognitive biases and vulnerabilities through deceptive design. Yeah, because it is fucking disturbing that they routinely hire monetization specialists with a background in psychology or the gambling industry. Yeah, when you think about it, why the fuck does the AAA industry hire so many psychologists who know precisely fuck all about video games and so much about evaluating why gamers make decisions. Because make no mistake, these decisions they are referencing are decisions about buying loot boxes, buying weapon skins, and buying time savers. They don't care which pet you decided to adopt, unless of course that is paid content as well. 2. Using aggressive marketing practices to push sales at every opportunity. Well, ain't that a fact? Look at the face spam in The Division 2 or Call of Duty. 3. Meaningless or misleading transparency disclosures about the likelihood to win or lose that are difficult to assess. Yeah, it's a travesty that we only get hints at drop rates accompanied by disclaimers that these might vary. To cite one of their examples, meaningless probabilities such as less than 0.1% is not actually useful consumer data. 0 is less than 0.1%. I am less than 50 foot tall. Working in the sex industry for less than 10 years could mean 9 years. Or you're not a sex worker at all. They basically tell you nonsense, vague ballpark figures disguised as facts, then stipulate that these stats might in fact change. 4. Opaque algorithms and skewed probabilities. This has always been a concern for me. I have long stated that the loot box drop rates are neither fair, uniform, and are frequently throttled. As anyone who has tried to grind an item set will attest, it is almost universal for you to get the first, say, 3 to 4 out of 6 items in the set quickly, the 5th takes a fucking eternity, and the last item in the set almost always either never drops or takes many times more than the rest combined, whilst the player is constantly offered a chance to buy more loot boxes to cap it instead. Not only do I assume that they throttle drop rates to drag out this process, but I assume that these days they routinely actively throttle drop rates with algorithms on the fly to push players towards the store, based on the player's consumer spending data, which they harvest from you perpetually. This is implied in their report too. 5. Using layers of virtual currency to mask or distort real-world monetary costs. Another pet hate of mine. You know the drill. The cheapest item in the store is 500 pedo coins, but the shop will only sell you units that precisely do not align with the value of items, nor any discrete monetary figure, like £10. So you end up being offered shit like 400 pedo coins for £8.67 or 1,200 for £22.98. The denominations are always obscure and inconvenient. The values never align with rounded off denominations of money, like 5, 10 or 20 bucks. And the conversion rate is always opaque and requires a fucking calculator in order to work out what any specific thing actually costs in real money. Seriously, it's not an accident that you never see the following. The item in the store costs 100 pedo coins. 100 pedo coins in the shop costs £10. Therefore the shitty fucking outfit with hipster shorts costs £10. They jump through hoops to hide real world costs. 6. Very high cost of freemium and endless grinding. Honestly, this is probably the main reason why I don't play freemium games anymore. I still play the occasional match of World of Tanks, but I certainly would not pick up a new free-to-play game, because basically it's all about making the grind so miserable that you are eventually persuaded/forced to get your credit card out to alleviate your suffering. Let us not forget that most of the egregious, vile and predatory monetization that we see these days are techniques and technologies forged in the crucible of freemium games, and these shitty business practices migrated into mobile apps and eventually mainstream video games. We all gave free-to-play games a fucking hall pass back in the day because of the mantra, well, it's okay for them to charge for stuff because the game itself is free. You know, like they were actually doing us a favour or being nice. The reality always was more like a drug dealer giving out a little bit of free heroin in the playground in the hope of cultivating future smack addicts. And let's be honest, a lot of us did become addicts. at least until we realised what was going on. 7. The risk of losing content at any time. This is another fuck in the arse that we've all got used to, apart from certain countries that legislated against it, like Finland. Video games are one of the few industries that somehow manage to operate completely outside of consumer trading laws that cover every other aspect of trade. You have to click agree on end-user license agreements that are sometimes hundreds of pages long and routinely updated, so you don't have a choice if you want to continue playing. You have to agree to partially legally unenforceable contracts which state they can shut down the game or ban you for no reason, but unless you have a spare $100,000 to spunk on a legal case, you can't do jack shit about the fact that the end-user license agreement is technically unenforceable. They are grade A fucks. This kind of rug pull also happens on the down low, especially in games like War Thunder, where they sell premium vehicles with godly stats and performance, then nerf it later, claiming it was only placeholder stats. Basically, to just try and force you to buy another premium vehicle with godly stats that they will later nerf. If you bought a car with a 500 brake horsepower engine and a month later the garage popped round your house and swapped it for a 1.1 litre diesel, you would be upset, right? Freemium publishers do this shit all the time. 8. Targeting loot boxes and manipulative practices at kids. Well, this is the core of it really, isn't it? Now, I'm not white knighting for children. Kids are fucking horrible. They all smell slightly of sick, and it's not like they do anything useful. You can't even send them out to get booze, because they won't get served. But children are the next generation of gamers, and I don't want them being groomed to accept gambling, throttled loot drops, and manipulated grind, and all the best content being paywalled. It's hard enough to fight against this shit as it is without there being a small army of gullible fucks who have never known anything different, screeching and squeaking at the growing minority on forums and on Reddit, telling them to shut the fuck up because they think it's entirely reasonable that the best loot in the game should come from the fucking in-game shop. They then go on to examine two notable examples of video games and abusive monetization: FIFA and Raid Shadow Legends, the Monsanto and Dow Chemical of video game franchises. This quote was golden. Both games employ a wide arsenal of tricks to push consumers into spending as much time and money as possible, exploiting consumers' hopes to receive the reward despite a minuscule chance and likelihood to do so. Nailed it. Although I would note that this business model pretty much describes everyone's antics these days, from Activision to Ubisoft. During this section there is a footnote that says the term microtransactions is often used as a synonym for in-game purchases like this. Since these purchases no longer seems micro in any sense, we will be using, and I quote, in-game purchase based. Now I know factually that my faith in humanity will never be restored, but if it were to be, it might possibly occur because of a statement like this. These guys actually know what the fuck they're talking about. And it kind of reminded me about a joke I made once upon a time about the Division's macro transactions. Then they go on to make a host of hilarious industry recommendations, which was frankly hysterical yet heartwarming to see. 1. Video game companies must be banned from using deceptive design to exploit customers. When consumers engage in video games, companies must ensure that their decisions are not impacted to the detriment of the consumer by the design and operation of the game. Basically, stop defrauding people in-game. 2. All in-game purchases should always be denominated in real-world currency. At the very least, real-world currency value should be provided alongside virtual currencies where virtual currencies are used. Basically, stop trying to deliberately scam people. 3. Protection of minors. A. Games likely to be accessed by minors must not offer loot boxes or other randomised content in exchange for real money. B. Games likely to be accessed by minors should not contain pay-to-win mechanisms. Basically, stop fiddling with children. 4. more transparency. A. Researchers and regulators should have access to the algorithms and datasets that are involved in the loot boxes to conduct independent research in the public interest. B. In cases where algorithmic decision making is employed to influence consumer behaviour, the consumer must be explicitly informed. The disclosure must include information in plain language about what algorithms are trained to achieve and which factors are used. In addition, the consumer should have the option to use the game without algorithmically driven decision making that aims to influence consumer behaviour. Basically, stop shredding the evidence of your crimes, open your books to scrutiny, and let people opt out of being fucked over by algorithms. 5. Better and more enforcement. Fuck, I'd settle for any enforcement. A. Consumer enforcement authorities must have the necessary resources and expertise to take enforcement actions, thus protecting consumers in digital markets, including protecting digital ownership. B. Consumer protection authorities should ensure that existing and future consumer rights are enforced in the gaming industry as well. Basically, these fucks should not be above the law, and they should stop stealing people's digital shit. 6. If other remedies do not alleviate the problems, consider a ban of paid loot boxes. Basically, if they don't comply, we should open fire. Now obviously these recommendations don't go quite far enough. I would like to see show trials, public floggings, all the people actively engaged in this societal predation publicly shamed, possibly in stocks, and forced to make video confessions and apologies. Like that one that John China did, only slightly less cringe and with a touch more dignity. Although I'm not ruling out pillories in the town square, whilst people throw rotten cabbages at them. Possibly we could squeeze in a couple of crucifixions? Just a thought. They also rightly point out that despite being the biggest entertainment industry on the planet, somehow they have almost entirely managed to sidestep regulation and avoid scrutiny, accountability, and for the most part, legality, allegedly. On this front I can save these scientists a lot of brow sweat and research and tell them exactly how that happened. It's called corporate corruption and white-collar crime. It's a pretty simple racket and it goes something like this. Corporations bribe politicians, and because politicians are self-serving narcissistic scum, they take the money and screw over the precise same people they are duty-bound to serve. Now, they have posh names for it, but don't let that befuddle you. It's basically old-fashioned bribery and corruption, which, like all modern white-collar crime, has been rebranded and called things like lobbying, party donations, business trips, and it's all mostly totally legal. Well, a lot of it is actually not strictly legal, but anyone who follows the news will be able to tell you that politicians can take all kinds of money and they just have to write it down in some register, and sometimes they even forget to do that, and if anything seems shady or corrupt or someone gets caught out being naughty, 99.9% of the time, precisely fuck all gets done. Because the people who are supposed to be investigating this shit, well, they work for the government too. I'm not a big fan of self-regulation, can you tell? All this skullduggery is why politicians who made lots of shitty decisions about deregulating certain industries or giving tax breaks to certain sectors end up on the board of directors at those exact same companies they helped out just a few years after leaving politics. That's why politicians make insane laws that benefit corporations and industries who incidentally just happen to be massive party donors. It's why most politicians spend their time in power doing very stupid things and saying even more stupider stuff, and just at the point where people are starting to suspect they couldn't actually be any more fucking stupid, they leave politics and get shoehorned into some multi-million-pound job on the board of directors of some company that they helped out a few years earlier, where they don't even have to show up for fucking work. And then everyone scratches their heads because these same incompetent fucks somehow managed to amass a personal fortune of hundreds of millions of pounds during their time in government on their relatively small salaries. Go figure, how did that happen? So yes, that's why the video game industry is unregulated. It's because they are rich. Politicians want to be rich, and nobody gives a fuck about anything other than the money train. In this equation at least, politicians are basically the governmental equivalent of shill video game reviewers. They pretend they're acting in your best interest, whilst taking kickbacks from video game publishers, and then bullshitting because they care about money and not you. Now, some people argue that government inaction is the result of old dusty politicians not knowing anything about video games, and it just kinda slid under the radar all this time. Whilst I assume that ignorance about video games is no doubt a factor in their incompetence regarding the industry, I call bullshit on the suggestion that somehow their total inaction, lack of enforcement and failure to police the video games industry all just boils down to their failure to notice it was really a thing. Video games is now a multi-billion-dollar industry and the single biggest sector of the global entertainment industry. So I'm pretty sure they have at least noticed that video games exist. It's pretty hard not to notice the global industry leader, right? Video games are now bigger than television, movies and radio. That is not the sort of thing that can just slip under the radar. It fills the whole fucking screen. Now, video games are older than social media and politicians are all over that shit like a rash. But I guess despite their lobbying, they get to swing elections, so politicians really want to control those motherfuckers. Video games, however, well, they have big bags of money and they stay out of politics, which is the golden ticket really. And as a footnote about the political failure to act, or to restrain the abuses of the video game industry, I would just note this. In the USA, the Entertainment Software Association spends twice as much money on lobbying than the National Rifle Association. Just to put this issue in perspective. And that is only the stuff that we know about, and the shit which has been declared. Significantly, the research report identifies very key, hard-hitting, salient points about the scumfuckery and sociopathic antics of the industry. Antics that so many gamers are painfully aware of and have been for many, many years. Loot boxes are deliberately targeting kids. Publishers know that kids are fleecing their parents' credit cards and causing debt. Video and mobile games are structured to force players to navigate sales pages constantly as part of routine play. Unlike all other online purchases, the mandatory 30-day cool-off period is not applied. They are exploiting cognitive biases and human psychological weaknesses. They exploit FOMO, the fear of missing out. Ergo, they introduce artificial time constraint to encourage rushed purchasing decisions. They also identified these ubiquitous strategies being exploited by publishers. The sunk cost fallacy, basically getting people invested in the game so they make decisions based on time and effort invested rather than evaluating future cost benefits. Survivorship bias, where a visible, successful subgroup is mistaken as an entire group. This is basically where people with fancy cosmetics get more screen time, get shown off more during end of match animations, or where they put extremely good players with cosmetics in your team so you associate fancy weapon skins with success, or when social media influencers open up a bunch of loot boxes and win nice shit. And it turns out that the odds were rigged and it's a giant fucking scam, and they are prosecuted by the district attorney for gambling fraud and then immediately hired as an influencer by Ubisoft, because they would run marketing initiatives with Adolf fucking Hitler if there was good money to be made. T. Martin, allegedly. The gambler's fallacy. Essentially, this is a cognitive bias where people incorrectly overestimate their chances of being successful based on past outcomes. Simply put, the gambler's fallacy works like this. Imagine if you're betting on a toss of a coin. Heads you win, tails you lose. Now imagine you have bet 12 times and it's been tails 12 times in a row. Of course, you would rightly assume that you should bet the house on the next toss being heads, right? Because the chances of being tails 13 times in a row is 1 in 8,192. I mean, there's a 1 in 6,000 chance that the coin will land on its edge. Of course, the next toss must be heads, right? Actually no. Whilst the probability of tossing 13 tails in a row is highly unlikely, at the point where you are tossing that coin for the 13th time, on that toss, it's still a 50-50 chance. Head or tails, one coin, two fucking sides, it's still an even split. But because we're human, we trick ourselves into thinking the next time we must get lucky, right? This is why you see old soaks at the casino slotting their entire week's wages into slot machines and throwing good money after bad, because they're chasing the debts down the rabbit hole, entertaining the fantasy that soon it will be their turn to win. In any other walk of life, if you'd done something 100 times and it had been a fucking disaster every time, you would assume that time 101 would be a disaster too. But in gambling, it's one of those strange areas of life where people think that just because they hit themselves with a brick 100 times and it hurt, on the 101st attempt, it will feel like a fucking blowjob. People make financial decisions based on emotion, narrative, self-image and ego. All the damn time. The entire foundation of the advertising industry is predicated on this. You think you're cold-hearted, logical and rational, but your feelings and emotions are frequently interwoven with your spending habits. That is why you don't buy the pink car even though it's 20% cheaper than the blue one. That is why you don't cut your own hair badly to save money. That is why people prefer to spend money rather than save money, because of the feelings of instant gratification. Humans are emotional beings, like it or not. As one prepper once said on a survivalist forum, "My shit hits the fan carry gun is a bright pink AR-15. You laugh, but given a choice, no motherfucker is going to want to steal the pink AR-15. What is even worse about the gambler's fallacy is, this is all bad enough based on real, static, fair odds like a coin toss, but we don't even get that with loot boxes. I'm convinced that video game publishers dynamically throttle your chances of winning to screw you out of every last penny, and they have as good as admitted this and lodged patents to that effect. So your odds of winning most likely get worse at precisely the time you are dropping your cash for that one last item, and at the very least, one item in the set will without doubt have fractional drop rates compared to the others, just to keep you spending. In fact, at this point, statistical probability might actually be an incorrect term to describe your odds of winning with pedo caches. Given everything else we know about industry-wide data harvesting and manipulation tactics, at this point it would be sensible to assume, based on patents, net gains and calculated methods of income extraction and the profiling they do on players, it is more likely that probability does not mean a raw drop chance, but something more along these lines. They might have a dynamic variable of how many loot boxes they want you to buy before you get the item. So it's not a 5% chance, it's most likely more like, on loot box 30 to 40, give them a prize, and then they throttle this percentage based on your spending profile. Whales get fucked. Hesitant spenders get rewarded more. That's my speculation based on the leaks and filed patents. They are deciding how much you spend before you get a drop, and they just mix it up a bit, add some variability, so people can't data mine the precise odds and game the system. I think the olden days of a 20-sided dice and honest random probability have gone. We are now in a new statistical gambling world, and that world is using algorithms and heuristics to suck all your money out of the bank. It's also now acknowledged that it's standard operating procedure to matchmake players with high spenders and manipulate the player experience based on data harvesting, although precise details of this are almost impossible to demonstrate because of the opaque nature of publishers' monetization strategies and their stubborn refusal to be transparent, accountable, honest or unambiguous. Which is weird really, because every other company in the marketplace has to be transparent, accountable and honest and unambiguous. Then the report mentions publishers are not only being deceptive about odds, they are manipulating those odds algorithmically. They mention how video game companies often grants itself, via the terms and conditions to use the video game, the power to change or revoke any in-game content at its own discretion. They make you sign a contract surrendering all your consumer rights, foregoing your right to sue, forcing any complaint into arbitration, and even when they make you sign shit they can't enforce, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to sue EA over a $50 game? No, you're not. Countries have tried that and lost. They examine the processes of designed obsolescence and how games force the player onto a hamster wheel of grinding and spending, and then either by power creep, releasing new content, or simply shit canning the game and releasing a sequel, they render everything you own, paid for, and work so hard to grind entirely redundant or inaccessible. That's why The Division 2 was released as a standalone game, so you could pay all over again for the same shitty cosmetics. That's why FIFA resets every year. That's why Call of Duty resets every year. That is why games don't let you carry over cosmetics, apparel and stuff you paid for to the sequels, because the whole point is engineering a situation where they can get you to pay all over again, preferably yearly, for exactly the same shit you bought last year. They go into great depth about the stacking of transactional layers so they can put as much distance as they can between an in-game purchase and its precise monetary value in real-world cash, a practice that would almost certainly be illegal in most other industries and may well technically be illegal in many territories here. But you know, governments and government agencies are not enforcing a damn thing for some reason. Imagine going to a shop to buy onions. The bag of onion costs 58 store credits. You can't buy 58 store credits though. The denominations are 50, 120, 400 and 1000. So you buy 120 store credits and it costs you £8.72. There are 9 onions in each bag. So I pose this fucking question to you. In real monetary terms, how much did the bag of onions cost? See my point? If a store in the UK pulled a stunt like this, there would be riots and the cops would turn up. Video game publishers pull this shit all the damn time. The report goes on to address meaningless probability clauses, which are not transparent, are entirely not backed up with evidence, may well be a lie, and are accompanied by legal disclaimers stating essentially, any statistics we give you may in fact be a lie. How cool is that? They give you drop rates, yet reserve the right to not tell you the truth. Genius! Then they did a financial and statistical breakdown on FIFA packs. Now I may be off with the terminology because I don't really understand FIFA, because I'd rather smoke heroin while practicing my hand grenade juggling than play that game. But their basic takeaway was this: in order to get Team of the Year, you would, on average, have to spend €13,500 on FIFA jumbo packs. Now that sucks a substantial quantity of balls. Section 3.1.6 is titled, Spend Money or Spend Years Grinding. Yeah, these science fuckers certainly seem to be getting the hang of this considering their based chapter headings alone. They dunk on FIFA, they dunk on Raid Shitty Legends, they taxonomically classify Raid Shadow Legends as a gacha game. Now I had to look this up, but a gacha is basically a game where the loot boxes are the game. You know Loot Box Simulator? It's like that apparently, only cut off the word simulator. And then there is another based chapter heading, 3.2.4, Pay a lot to win. Fuck me, if these guys swore a bit more and started a YouTube channel they'd give me a run for my money. They discuss manipulation and showcasing rare wins to aid confirmation bias. They basically spend a lot of time and care to explain in detail how the monetization in video games, from a methodological and execution perspective, is basically scummy to its core. Many of these techniques, like sunk cost fallacy, survivorship bias, the gambler's fallacy and FOMO, are textbook techniques employed by snake oil merchants, conmen and casinos. The techniques used by monetizers are a manual for manipulating people into making bad purchasing decisions, and in any other industry where your credit card was involved, in the purchase you are legally entitled to change your mind afterwards because of the known harms associated with these kind of sales tactics. People are protected from this skeevy shit in every other walk of life, but for some reason nobody is enforcing this on game publishers. And if you decide to exercise your rights by appealing the payment on PayPal or charging back on your credit card, the publishers almost universally shut down your entire account permanently as a malicious act of vengeance. Basically, if you dare to exercise your lawful consumer rights, they punish you by taking away everything you ever paid for, ever. Scumlords. This is basically fiscal retribution for simply exercising your legal consumer rights. Look, this report is a fucking how-to manual for being a shitty manipulative scam merchant, and analysing it in depth would require a 200-page book, so let me read out some key points they go on to make. The data harvesting from players constitutes a grave invasion of privacy. Data breaches have shown these companies pose a huge data protection risk to the customer. There is a deliberate and fundamental lack of transparency, which means investigating the worst of their crimes is nigh on impossible. The drop rates and algorithms have thus far entirely escaped regulatory scrutiny. Aggressive and egregious marketing practices occur in and out of game. They round this off all nicely with a little fireside chat about how deceptive these bastards are and how it's hard to fathom that loot boxes have become such a massive multi-billion-dollar industry. All the people doing it entirely resist transparency, constantly engage in deliberate and systematic deception, yet somehow have thus far entirely escaped any scrutiny or accountability. Yeah, go figure. I've been scratching my fucking bonce about that one for a while now. Imagine if the biggest drug company in the world didn't have to comply with statutory regulations or respond to disclosure inquiries. Okay, possibly a bad example, but you get my point in principle. One conundrum they brought up is that of the legal term of gambling, and this part was smart. They noted that trying to manage loot boxes legally from the perspective of gambling might actually be problematic, because people can fight all day about the legal definition of gambling, and the laws vary from territory to territory. I drew the conclusion that they were suggesting that direct legislation of loot boxes might sidestep that entire quagmire, and facilitate a response with no pre-existing legal hurdles. It could be rolled out across multiple territories without legal battles trying to assert that loot boxes are, in a legal sense, gambling. This part was fascinating really, and frankly fucking astute. Loot boxes are by every reasonable standard a game of chance where people play for money and lose vast amounts of money. This is gambling at its very core, only not according to certain specific legal definitions and criteria as stipulated by national laws that require things such as the ability to cash out. It's a perfect example of where local legal definitions don't map onto logical common sense and functional definitions. Loot boxes are fucking gambling, but they get off the hook on a technicality, one they are very happy to keep bringing up. You can't cash out. Perhaps trying to get loot boxes classified as gambling in order to regulate them is a trap. Perhaps their entire defence is hinged on asserting that loot boxes are legally not gambling, and perhaps, just fucking perhaps, this is the hill that video game publishers want us to die on. Perhaps the best strategy is to walk around that hill, stop trying to get them banned as gambling, avoid the whole gambling argument altogether, and just ban fucking loot boxes. Then you don't have to worry about legal definitions of what constitutes gambling. You just say loot boxes, because everyone knows exactly what that scummy shit is. And as soon as that dawned on me, I had a moment of absolute fucking clarity. Video game publishers are always way ahead of us with their evil schemes. Video game corporations have rooms full of lawyers, and they're always better prepared. They think ahead. Video game publishers are the sort of people who have that box of puppies, the pocket full of sweeties, and the cable ties long before they ever get close to the playground. And I think they've already thought this whole thing through. They know that the gambling approach to loot box regulation is a big trap that benefits them and screws us, because they can argue all day long that loot boxes don't technically qualify as gambling according to nearly all local gambling legislation, and they probably also realise that their Achilles heel is people just going after the loot boxes directly. And then the penny dropped. That is why the publishers avoid saying words like loot boxes altogether. They avoid the term, and they try to avoid admitting that their products are loot boxes. Remember this?
Do you consider loot boxes to be an ethical feature of your games? Kerry?
Well, first, we don't call them loot boxes. I think that was
Whatever term you wish to apply to them, do you
so,
consider them ethical?
So what we look at as surprise mechanics.
This fucking stupidity makes absolute complete sense within the context of them not wanting to admit that they sell, and I quote, loot boxes, or admit any definition of what a loot box is. Maybe this is the strategic switch that needs to be made by the consumer groups. Don't go after it as gambling, just go for the jugular of loot boxes, because we can bosh up a definition of loot box in an afternoon and there's no damn legal defence already in place for publishers to hide behind. So yeah, I could say many negative things about this sociopathic abuse enabler, but I doubt she got where she is today by being stupid. And maybe surprise mechanics is the smart thing to say, and whilst we were all laughing at her, they were all laughing at us. They were all laughing at us laughing. She was avoiding admitting in front of Parliament that she even acknowledged the existence of loot boxes or that EA actually sold them. That's why she insisted on referring to them as surprise mechanics. It's a sobering and humble conclusion, but maybe the joke was always on us. Then they went into a list of statutory bodies, regulations and regulators that had powers and a remit to challenge the status quo of loot box abuse. Not gonna lie, this list and the description read more along the lines of, here are a bunch of organisations who should be fucking these guys up, but for some reason we don't understand, they're sitting around with their thumbs up their arses whistling Dixie. European consumer protection laws as enshrined by the entire European Commission, the Unfair Contract Terms Directive, the UCTD, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, the UCPD, the Consumer Protections Directive, the CRD, all the consumer protection apparatus in the United States. There is a plethora of local, state, federal consumer protection laws, all with related enforcement agencies, all ultimately under the umbrella of the Federal Trade Commission, all of whom are doing precisely nothing about any of these issues with monetisation and predatory tactics targeting children. Ultimately, in the EU, the USA and for that matter here in the UK, at face value, video game publishers are obviously engaging in shitty and most likely illegal anti-consumer activities. There are plenty of institutions who could do something about it, with plenty of laws in place to help. But for reasons unbeknownst to man nor fucking beast, there is a complete lack of will to act. And that is so important, it's worth saying twice. There are plenty of ways that the authorities could step in, and they have the apparatus and means to act given the way these companies are marketing loot boxes to kids and conducting data harvesting on minors, but for some strange reason, they have zero will to act. We know they had the ability to act if they wanted to, because authorities went after YouTube for the same shit without batting an eyelid. But for some reason, data harvesting from kids and using deceptive advertising and psychological manipulation is just fucking peachy and perfect if the platform being used is video games. That is a very strange and inexplicable double standard. Why is that? They went after big tech for exactly the same thing. Okay, let's be real, we know exactly why nothing is being done. Because video games are now the biggest market in the global entertainment industry, and the lion's share of their entire revenue comes from shady monetization and heinous pedo-cash products, and they lobby the shit out of governments. This is what happens when any new industry emerges, it's entirely unregulated, and they have quite literally bags of money they can drop off at people's houses. I'm sure it's all organised in a slightly more classy way than that. Or maybe not. Let's not sugarcoat it. Anyone who follows gaming news regularly knows what the deal is these days. Video game publishers are factually engaged in bribing reviewers, blackmailing YouTubers, bribing YouTubers, covert advertising that violates laws in many territories and violates many social media platforms' regulations, organised harassment, dishonest advertising, legal bullying, gaslighting the public, regulatory bodies and fucking parliaments, defying the rule of international law, and just in case you missed that word, it was bribing. They often conduct their shady business using third-party promotional entities, by back-channel means, or just like in-game currency, they stack transactional denominations, so it's untraceable as a direct bribe, like paying off YouTubers and reviewers with advertising revenue, channel boosting, free gifts, business trips, free merchandise, exposure and early access. But it is what it is. It's bribery. They do naughty things and try and stack layers of deniability between themselves and their wrongdoings, like organised crime syndicates, or those nice fellas in Baltimore that sell drugs but get kids to take the money from the buyers and other kids to deliver the drugs to the cars. So what are my overall thoughts on all of this thus far? Well, straight off the back of the recommendations I would just add this. Awesome job. If anyone involved with this report ever watches this video, I owe you a fucking beer or 9. This said, I would personally opt for a slightly more draconian approach and attack the list from the bottom up. Ban all loot boxes because they're shitty. Video game companies should be scrutinised like TV broadcasters, social media companies and fucking casinos. Fuck knows they make more money and they do it with casual or a flirtatious respect of the law. Seriously, we need a video game commission with teeth, like the ATF, only doing something actually fucking useful. In fact, why not fire everyone at the ATF and hire them as video game publisher enforcement officers? Every single algorithm, probability or reward in a game should be transparent and ready for inspection, period. It should be written on the proverbial box. In fact, scrap algorithms in place of flat, set percentage chances, which are immediately available for inspection and audit. All player manipulation that is driven by sales and marketing should be outlawed. I'm not kidding. Matchmaking based on cosmetic items, banned. Pay to win must be banned. Putting you in easy win matches after you spend money, banned. All metrics must be transparent. None must be used to manipulate spend. All should be random, fixed odds, and capable of real-time audit. Having scrutinised this report in detail, and fully planning on reading every single damn article and research paper referenced in the document, this study is basically a treasure trove of information about the shittiness of the industry. It's like the Hitler diaries of video games, only unlike the diaries, this shit is actually real. In fact, this report is perhaps best described as a catalogue of crimes, as scientists, social policy experts and researchers finally have that mic drop moment and announce that video game publishers are to honest consumer spending what Kevin Spacey is to good childcare standards. In fact, based on the total aggregate of egregious activities and harm that video game monetizers are engaged in these days, it's not inconceivable that Kevin Spacey represents less of a threat to vulnerable teenage boys than AAA video game publishers. Now that's a damning indictment. The business model of video game companies certainly seems to fairly precisely map onto other industries with similar aspirations, goals, methodologies, and complete absence of morality. Obviously I'm talking about drug dealers, racketeers, and big pharmaceutical companies. These guys seem to have looked at Martin Shkreli and thought, now that's the guy we should emulate. Although technically, Martin Shkreli did nothing wrong. Martin Shkreli did nothing wrong. Now that is a t-shirt concept. What I mean by that is, he is a sinister piece of shit. However, what he did is what pharmaceutical companies do all the damn time, only he did it with less finesse, no mindfulness of the PR implications, and he stuck his oh so perfectly slippery face into the media spotlight where he was easy to villainise. The reality, however, is that he did what other companies do all the damn time, only politicians are too shit scared to take on other big pharma companies, but Shkreli was just one guy, so they could put on a big show trial and crucify him in the town square. In fact, the Shkreli situation probably has a lot to teach us about how most governments will react to this report. Many of them will be too shit scared to take on monolithic corporations like Activision and EA, but I'm sure they'll rake a few smaller developers over the coals as an exercise in showboating and propaganda. I am not white knighting for gambling addicts or people with weak impulse control issues, although frankly, why the fuck are corporations using video games to prey on the weak? The other issue here is that all games get worse because of monetization, and that is something you should not forget. Even if monetization and loot boxes don't affect you personally, the quality of the game does. Because these days more and more of the actual content is being removed from the base game and hidden away in paywalled content. We're increasingly expected to pay our 50 quid and get less than half the content, with all the nice outfits, special events, rare or unique loots hidden away in DLC, loot boxes, or the fucking in-game store. And this is why publishers are driving so hard for NFTs and desperately trying to push them into video games despite the massive amount of backlash and pushback. A close friend of mine made me appreciate what NFTs are really all about. And it's obvious once someone says it to you. NFTs are a facilitator for the total monetization in video games. That's why they love NFTs so much. It's a way to assign pseudo-monetary value to every damn loot drop in a game, so that ultimately they can monetize everything. Setting aside the benefits of having literal NFTs in a video game, so the publisher can effectively be the banker, the money printer, the financial regulator, and the exchange platform, it's not just about the intrinsic profits they can get from the NFTs. NFTs are a gateway to the holy grail of video game publishers. It's a means to facilitate the monetization of literally everything in video games. Because ultimately this is the end game here. They want a future where you buy your loot. Well, that's a horrible thought. But once you think about it, it was always kind of obvious. NFTs means they can monetize all loot in video games, literally and figuratively, under the pretense of offering crypto benefits. It's a fucking trap, as that nice lizard man would say. When it comes to our current set of heinous problems, some governments will be slow to take real action because of lobbying. Here in the UK, the gambling lobby have their fists so far up the backsides of the bunch of corrupt scumbuckets that we refer to as members of parliament, if they splayed their fingers, the politicians' eyeballs would probably pop out. Our government of shills, fraudsters, thieves and bribe collectors won't lift a damn finger to regulate actual problem gambling, so why the fuck would they intervene with something that's managed thus far to disguise itself as not legally gambling? And let's not forget this entire shit show is also embroiled in possibly the biggest marketing scam of our generation, the covert influencer marketing scam. Not only are these companies doing all of this gambling shit, they're deploying and propagandising the whole slimy operation using an army of covert advertisers on YouTube and Twitch. Sorry, but a huge swathe of the content creators you love and trust are actually paid advertisers. But will governments actually do anything about this? Well, this is a question with several answers. Fuck knows is the first part of the answer. Secondly, if they do something, it won't happen fast. I've been railing on monetisation, pedo caches and kiddie gambling in video games for fucking years now, and whilst it's actually a relief to finally see official looking people with proper jobs, writing grown up professional words, which are basically exactly what I've been screaming about since the old days of the Division 1, I am not expecting anything to happen quickly. Watching these daft fucks catch up with the reality of predatory monetisation has taken more than half a decade, and they have only got to the point where they are asking questions and writing reports. Most countries have still done jack shit about it, with the exception of countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, who took it upon themselves to act unilaterally, although absolute respect to them for that. Now, if it took 5 years for people to finally get the memo, and for singular governments to start taking remedial action in their respective parliaments, imagine how long it will take the whole of the EU or an international body of countries to sit down, have a powwow and agree to something between them that they can all sign up to. It took an individual country 5 fucking years. The EU alone will probably take another 5 to 10 years to finally agree to something that everybody will approve. And any unified international or European response will most likely be the lowest common denominator which is acceptable to all, massaged down as much as possible by whichever governments are getting lobbied hardest by the video game industry. Then of course there is the issue of what they do. Frequently when the government steps in to allegedly fix a problem by introducing legislation, what happens is something along the following lines. All the politicians showboat publicly about fake moral outrage. They write laws that make good headlines. They are almost universally ignorant of what the actual fuck is really going on. Or they know precisely what is going on because they're somehow involved in the lobbying and the scam itself. Secretly, corporations are lobbying the fuck to get the laws watered down. The end result usually turns out to be a fuck farm of botched compromises that ends up fucking a load of people over and not solving the original problem. Example: the UK's legislation addressing knife crime. Despite decades of doubling down on offensive weapons legislation that has resulted in the most draconian knife laws on the entire fucking planet, not only has our knife crime not gone down, it's fucking gone up. Recently we had a year with a worse murder rate in London than they had in New York. Plus, now we have a shit ton of completely law-abiding citizens getting arrested and getting jail time for committing the heinous crimes of being tricked into admitting that their small Swiss Army knife could in theory be used for self-defence, forgetting to take their Stanley knife off their belt when they take a break from carpet laying and go to the shops to get a sandwich, and for forgetting that they own something that has been completely legal for hundreds of years, which suddenly became criminalised because of the vague wording in some subsection of a new law. This is frequently what happens when governments try and legislate a problem about which they know not one fuck. You can now go to prison because your knife is painted green and has the word zombie on it. And no, that is actually not a joke. You can go to prison because you made a blowpipe. Not even kidding. Blowpipes are now an offensive weapon in the UK. And my personal fucking favourite is, if you put a noxious chemical in a bottle and spray someone with it, even if it's chili sauce, by preparing the noxious liquid to use as a defensive tool, it's now, drumroll please, subject to the same sentencing as firearms. Yes, pepper spray now comes under firearms offences. You can't make this shit up. And none of this, absolutely none of this, has done a damn thing to reduce knife crime. The gangs are still stabbing people, but the jails are at least filling up with people who forgot to take their bushcraft knife out of their car when they got back from scout camp. Not to mention the fact that they should have just renamed the recent legislation the Amazon Bill, because the initial draft was trying to make online knife sales via the mail illegal. Yes, they were trying to ban anyone selling knives online and posting them to you in the mail. So if the original draft had been approved, it would have destroyed all online knife sales and craft knife companies in the United Kingdom, and the only people conveniently selling knives online would be Amazon, because all of their knives are delivered by their own delivery agents. Amazon, overnight, would have ended up being the only company in the UK where you could buy kitchen knives or any knives online. Somebody was getting a big fucking payoff to push that legislation. Like I said, politicians are generally ignorant, and if they ain't, it's probably because they're getting fucking paid by someone. So yes, cynical as I am, even if governments do take action, it's a source of concern that the action will be a monumental act of retardation. I have no doubt that the corporate lobbyists will succeed in watering down any new laws where possible, and perhaps even more concerning is the prospect that the legislation will be hijacked and used to form some kind of video gamer registry and database, where people have to log in with their actual ID to play 18+ rated games. Let's face it, the UK government tried to protect the little children on the internet by proposing that everyone in the UK be forced to show their fucking passport or driving licence to access porn sites. Fucking stupidity on a monumental scale. Let's just say if that ever happens, I'll be buying shares in VPN companies. And anyone dumb enough to actually comply will be getting all of their bank accounts cleaned out by hackers. On the plus side, they did suggest a scheme where people could get adult ID registration cards from the post office. Yes, effectively a porn passport, which you would have to apply for at your local post office, with a porn passport application form that you would have to fill in and hand to that nice lady who helps you with your Christmas parcels every year. These guys are fucking clueless. Will there be international or European consensus in the short term? Don't know. If governments do make sweeping legislative changes, it may well be shit. It also may well be a backdoor for spying on gamers, since we are largely perceived by progressive governments as a hotbed of neo-Nazi hate-mongers who radicalise each other whilst we're killing pigs. In Elwyn Forest. And any legislation will most likely have been infiltrated and mutated by the video game megacorporations themselves to be marginally effective, easily circumvented, and a bit shit. I am elated that grown-up scientists are finally learning about predatory monetization, and it's rather impressive that it's only taken them half a fucking decade to become almost as well informed as your average 14-year-old gamer, but I am not optimistic that anything tangible and sensible will arise from any of this anytime soon. Sadly, video game publishing seems to suffer from a very common corporate dysfunction, which we shall herein refer to as evolutionary douchery. It's basically a combination of deferred responsibility and corporate psychopath syndrome with a little bit of Darwin sprinkled in for good measure. It's something that I have observed a lot in the corporate world, and this little dance goes something like this. You know how Darwin said all that shit about how penguins evolved to drink human blood in order to give them an evolutionary advantage? Maybe it wasn't penguins. Maybe it was starlings. Or chipmunks. And maybe it was eating babies or cannibalism or something. It doesn't really matter. What matters is this. Creatures develop new traits, and if they help them survive, those traits flourish, as do that species. Evolution basically makes the case of the survival of the fittest. Essentially, out there in the brutal and savage natural world, in any given system, life forms that develop changes that give them an advantage will be more likely to survive and reproduce, whereas maladaptive responses or a failure to adapt to get a competitive advantage will lead to less success and eventual extinction. That's why you don't see rabbits like this in countries where lots of people own this. Because if you come from a long and noble line of slow-moving fat as fuck rabbits that look cute, like cuddles and wiggle their nose when they get stroked, well, you ain't gonna last very long around a hunter-gatherer community. You were just dinner. Evolutionary pressures means you adapt and survive, and learn to fucking run usually, and be really, really skittish around any nice man, making funny kissy-kissy noises with his mouth, whilst clutching a fucking spear. In the corporate world, the same principles are frequently at work, only it's more like survival of the biggest sociopathic, lying, narcissistic, predatory fucking dicklord. Sad but true. I'm being absolutely serious. In the corporate world, being a sociopath, a psychopath, lacking empathy and generally having no morals is a skill set that is a well-known and well-proven way to advance at the expense of your nice, moral, empathic co-workers. Combine this with deferred responsibility and people's tenacious habit of adopting the attitude of claiming, "I was only following orders," and we get to here. A world full of corporations doing great evil in the world, where individual actors doing bad things move up the corporate ladder faster than anyone else, and when they get there, they shrug and say, "Well, if I wasn't doing this evil shit, somebody else would." Basically, the more of a psychopath you are, the more likely it is that you'll get promoted, therefore the greater likelihood that your video game publishing company will have the scum rise to the top, and it will be making decisions and employing the sociopaths required to do all of the terrible things they are clearly doing now. This principle is well known and well documented. The psychopaths move to the top of any corporate structure. Some corporations have even recently abandoned yearly staff appraisals precisely because they mainly benefit and service the needs of, and I quote, narcissistic sociopaths and psychopaths, because they are the best at gaming the system, and they are already advancing up the company ladder the fastest. God, this world is fucked up. Personally, I swear by this theory, based on my experiences of the video game industry alone, because I have met several community managers. Well, I guess it's time to roll this victim in plastic cling wrap and drop them in the flooded quarry, with a few heavy rocks included just for good measure. I probably come across as having a very dim view of large corporations and politicians, and that's probably because it's true. But I have good reason, and I will demonstrate that with one simple example. At the start of this video, I mentioned the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, where tobacco companies now pay vast amounts of money every year as reparations for their former crimes. Now, vaping might be better or worse for you than smoking in the long run. Nobody really knows yet because there aren't any longitudinal studies done over a whole lifespan, because it's a relatively new practice. Most evidence, however, certainly seems to clearly show that in the short and mid-term at least, vaping is vastly healthier than smoking cigarettes. And before anyone says anything about popcorn lung, it's a fucking urban myth. Yes, the vape flavourings often do contain acetyl in tiny amounts. Certain foods like popcorn contains a shit ton of acetyl. It's the buttery taste additive. The incident at the popcorn factory that gave this phenomenon its name, where workers got lung damage from inhaling acetyl, was not mild exposure. Several industrial oil drums of acetyl were damaged and leaked into the ventilation system. This was a chemical spill incident, and the workers were all poisoned. They didn't just breathe in a bit or smell the fumes occasionally while they worked there. It was a chemical spill. If you had poured many gallons of any industrial food additive into the ventilation system and gassed people with it, workers would have been harmed. But my point is, In the United States, many politicians are starting to rally for a complete ban of vaping, and many think this is genuine, albeit misguided action based on the best interests of people's health. Actually, it's the exact fucking opposite. Not even kidding. So why are politicians suddenly trying to ban vaping and spreading all kinds of sensational stories about people vaping once and their heads exploding like in Scanners? Simple really, although this might shock you. It's because of the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. You see, the settlement payments are calculated every year based on the number of people in each state that smoke cigarettes. Then suddenly the popularity of vaping exploded because it was more healthy and less antisocial than smoking. Even doctors started to recommend it. Then the first settlement payment came in, which had a huge chunk of money missing because so many people had quit cigarettes and started vaping instead. All of a sudden, state officials shit their pants because they were no longer getting as much free money from the tobacco industry every year as they had become accustomed to receiving. Suddenly out of nowhere, state governments were rallying to ban vaping. They are not trying to ban it to protect anyone's health. They are trying to ban vaping so that people are driven back to smoking cigarettes, so they can get their big, fat, fucking paychecks from big tobacco every year. So if I seem a little bit jaded about the antics that occur when big corporations collide with politics, it's because, as a general rule, even when these arseholes are pretending to help you, it's because there is something in it for them, and they might not actually even be helping you at all. But yes, this report is a good news, bad news scenario really. On a positive note, after years of being accused of paranoia, hyperbole and whinging, finally the establishment has turned around and said, yeah, these video game publishers are a threat to society. They are doing all that nasty shit people say they do, and they need to be stopped, because what they are doing is harmful and quasi-legal, borderline illegal. It brings me no joy to be right. Who am I kidding? I'm fucking ecstatic that I'm right, and I've been completely right all along, and all the fucklords who attacked me, many of whom are, or have been, beneficiaries of video game publishers' promotional budgets, or just downright shameless shills, can all go fucking lick the sweat off a fat tramp's arse crack. It is rare for me to encourage people to read, because as everyone knows, reading books is for fucking idiots. But I would on this one occasion strongly encourage you all to read this report. I appreciate that it's an incredibly long read, clocking in at 56 pages long, and there are no pictures or anything you can colour in. But it's a mind-bending dose of based social policy research, and frankly made me feel validated by seeing practically 5 years of relentless griping distilled into a single document by people who can write properly, albeit with stunted swearing skills and an almost criminal disinterest in talking about tits. Ultimately, games get worse because of monetisation. People get ripped off, addicts get encouraged, addicts get groomed and consolidated, addicts are being forged in the crucible of monetisation. We all get lied to and misled by the content creators within our own gaming communities, mainstream reviewers and the publishers themselves. Everyone is a loser if this continues, apart from the shareholders, because these guys are hiring psychologists, gambling specialists and experts in addiction to orchestrate what is best described as a consumer-based psy-ops operation on their own customers. And they are getting better at this every day. The AAA, freemium and mobile gaming industry is blatantly reverse engineering an addiction crisis, and I hope that at some point there may be a reckoning. Let's not forget, this is the snowflake generation and these guys start protests over fucking pronouns. When it becomes apparent that a whole generation of children are dopamine dependent, gambling addicts, and the video game industry did it to them deliberately, I honestly think it's not impossible that class action lawyers and showboating politicians will eventually rock up to the door and start demanding settlements like the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. Very importantly though, just like the tobacco industry, I think this is a can of worms that will only open from the inside. We need whistleblowers. We need people on the inside who are sick of this shit, phoning up their lawyers, finding out what the whistleblower legislation is in their territory and where it is legal and ethical, spilling their guts to the authorities and the press. We need people who know exactly how the darkest shit works to come forward with evidence and spill the beans. You could always drop me a quick DM. But obviously, stay 100% legal at all times. Or at least try not to get caught. But for now, good luck and happy hunting.